Tonight, we're going to drift back in time to uncover the strange, forgotten ways people once tried to sleep. From noble chambers to peasant huts, the night looked very different than it does for us. If you've ever wondered how people found rest in a world without electricity, tonight's story is for you. Close your eyes. Imagine the silence of a medieval castle. Only the flicker of candlelight and the sound of your own breath. Sleep was never just sleep. It was ritual, survival, and sometimes even politics. Before we drift off together, let's wander into the forgotten world of nighttime, where kings turned their beds into thrones, and peasants curled on straw under smoky rafters. If you're still awake, perhaps leave a quiet comment. Tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy drifting through these slow journeys into the past, a gentle tap on subscribe will keep you close for the next story. Maybe share this with a friend who also struggles to fall asleep. History is always better when it's shared. And if you'd like, whisper into the comments what kind of history you'd like to dream through next. Your ideas might guide the next night's story. When night falls and the world slips into quietness, something remarkable happens. You, lying in your bed, drift into a state that the ancients thought was far from ordinary. Sleep, in the old imagination, was not just the body's rest. It was a journey, a crossing into another realm. And among the Greeks, perhaps more than almost any other ancient people, sleep and dreams were bound tightly to the world of the gods. Let us begin slowly, carefully, the way the old storytellers would. Close your eyes if you like. Imagine the blue Aegean Sea, calm under moonlight, the smell of olive groves in the night air, the faint hum of insects. In such a world, ordinary farmers and fishermen went to sleep believing they were never truly alone. Behind their eyelids, they thought, the gods still moved, whispering, showing signs, shaping lives. For the Greeks, sleep was not an empty silence. It was filled with personalities. The god Hypnos, the personification of sleep itself, was believed to hover invisibly at bedsides. His twin brother, Thanatos, represented death, the eternal sleep. And beyond them stretched a whole host of dream-bringers, the Oneiroi, fluttering like shadows into human minds. To fall asleep in the Greek world was to enter into the company of beings that were powerful, mysterious, and sometimes unnervingly close. You see, the Greeks did not separate life from myth the way we do. The stars in the sky, the rustle of the night wind, even the heaviness of your eyelids, all were threads in the great fabric of divine influence. Sleep was not private, it was sacred. And for this reason, much of Greek religion was tied to nighttime rituals, temple dreams, and a careful awareness of what slumber could reveal. Think for a moment of the simple act of lying down in an ancient Greek household. The home itself was plain, a one-room structure of stone and clay, the floor often packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or reeds. Families slept together in such spaces, children close to parents, everyone arranged according to warmth and convenience rather than the privacy we expect today. Lamps burned faintly, fueled by olive oil, casting long shadows against the walls. In that faint light, sleep came, and with it perhaps a dream that might be more than a dream. Even in the most ordinary of Greek villages, a dream could change a life. Farmers who dreamt of full grain sacks or fat sheep would take it as a sign from the gods, a promise of harvest. A soldier on campaign, waking from a dream of eagles, would believe Zeus himself had favored his side. And if the dream was troubling, of serpents or of blood, it was thought to be a warning. To ignore such things was to risk angering the divine order. But to understand how deeply this shaped Greek culture, you must picture the temples. Scattered across the Greek world were sacred places where sleep itself was ritualized. The most famous were the temples of Asclepius, the god of healing. People came to these sanctuaries not only for medicines or rituals, but for sleep. They practiced what was called incubation. lying down in the temple, waiting for a dream that would reveal a cure. The priests believed Asclepius sent visions at night, guiding the sick toward remedies. Imagine hundreds of pilgrims, stretched out on stone benches or simple mats, drifting into sleep with the hope that their dreams would contain the answer to their suffering. This is not a superstition unique to Greece. Across many cultures, sleep has been linked to healing, but in the Greek imagination, it became formalized, structured, a nightly dialogue between human weakness and divine wisdom. Sleep was not passive. It was a tool. If you are listening right now, drifting with the rhythm of these words, notice how the Greeks might have thought of you. Perhaps you too are under hypnosis' soft wings. Maybe your own dreams tonight will feel heavier with meaning, and if you find this thought oddly comforting, perhaps leave a quiet comment later when morning comes, sharing whether you dreamt of anything strange. It would amuse the old storytellers to know their whispers still linger. The role of sleep in Greek mythology reaches further still. In Homer's epics, dreams often appear as messengers. A general preparing for war may be visited at night by a god disguised in familiar form, urging him toward action. The line between sleeping and waking was blurred. What came in a dream was no less real than the events of daylight. To the Greeks, a dream was not fantasy. It was communication. And so, there were men and women who made it their duty to interpret these night messages. Dream interpreters existed in villages and cities, offering their services to anyone unsettled by what they had seen. Some charged coins, others operated within temple systems. Over time, vast collections of dream symbolism were compiled, like the famous Oneirocritica of Artemidorus in the 2nd century. If you dreamt of water, it meant one thing, of birds, another. The practice may sound quaint today, yet in truth it reveals something striking. Humans have always longed to find order in the chaos of sleep. But what did sleep itself mean in the Greek imagination? If Hypnos was its god, what kind of figure was he? Ancient poets describe him as gentle, with wings on his shoulders, moving quietly through the world, touching mortals and immortals alike. Unlike his brother Thanatos, who was feared as the end of life, Hypnos was comforting. He came without violence. He was rest. And yet he could be dangerous too. In the Iliad, Hera bribes Hypnos to put Zeus himself to sleep, allowing her to meddle in the war. Sleep, then, was not just peace, it was power. And the Greeks knew this in their own lives. A well-rested soldier fought better. A farmer who rose too late missed the cool hours of morning labor. To fall asleep too deeply during watch could be deadly. Thus, sleep was praised and feared, cherished and distrusted, much as we feel today, though we wrap it in the language of science rather than myth. Picture, then, the nightly rhythm of an Athenian household. The day ended with supper, bread, and olives, sometimes fish, washed down with watered wine. Conversation dwindled. Lamps were lowered. Slaves, if the household had them, might retire to corners or the entryway. Parents gathered their children, the family lay close, and one by one, they drifted off. The city outside did not vanish, of course. Athens at night was filled with the sound of dogs, the steps of night watchmen, and occasionally the music of revelers returning from a symposium. But in each home, Hypnos arrived, and with him, perhaps, a dream from Olympus. You may notice how ordinary this feels, the act of eating, lying down, slipping into sleep. And yet, for the Greeks, the ordinary was never free of divine presence. Each moment was layered with meaning. Even the simplest act of closing the eyes belonged to a larger story. Perhaps this is what makes their mythology so enduring. It lived in the details of everyday life, not only in the grand tales of heroes. As you listen, your own breathing may be slower, the room around you fading into a kind of ancient stillness. It is easy to imagine that the gods of sleep walk quietly still, unnoticed yet familiar. And maybe that is the secret reason we return to these old stories. They remind us that something as common as sleep can feel vast, almost holy. But let us not rush. We are still at the beginning of this long exploration. We have only met hypnos, thanatos, and the vague outlines of dreams. The Greek world contained far more layers, strange rituals, elaborate temple practices, and the curious ways in which ordinary men and women thought of night as a landscape to be walked carefully. It is tempting to ask, did they truly believe? Did farmers really think their dream of a bird was the voice of Zeus? Did soldiers honestly trust that a night vision meant victory? Or did they perhaps take it as a kind of comfort, a way of framing uncertainty? The answer, like sleep itself, is half in shadow. Before we move on, let me ask you something. When you dream, do you treat it as nothing? Or do you sometimes wonder if it carries weight? If you wake tomorrow remembering only fragments, perhaps take a moment to write them down, as Artemidorus once advised. You may be surprised how often the mind, in its night wanderings, reflects the hidden truths of waking life. And so we end this first step among the Greek gods of sleep, hovering between myth and daily existence. Hypnos spreads his wings softly across the earth. Thanatos waits silently nearby, and the oneiroi flutter endlessly through the dreams of mortals. The question, lingering like a faint whisper in the night, is this. If the Greeks saw sleep as a message, then what exactly were the gods trying to tell them? Section 2. The ancients were never content to think of sleep as mere silence. They believed the night had structure, rules, and pathways that one could walk if properly prepared. Dreams were not random flickers of the brain, but channels opened to the divine. And in no place was this idea clearer than in the temples where sleep itself became ritual, sacred, deliberate, and, for many, their only hope of healing. We must return now to the sanctuaries of Asclepius, the god of medicine. Scattered across the Greek world, from Epidaurus to Pergamon, these shrines became destinations for the sick. Not because the priests promised medicines or surgeries in the way we imagine today, but because they promised access to the god through sleep. This practice, known as enkoimesis, incubation, was among the strangest religious acts of the ancient world. Imagine the journey. A man with aching joints, or a woman with a wound that would not close, or a child struck with fever. All would travel, sometimes for days, to reach the sacred grounds. At the temple gates they would purify themselves, bathing in cold water, offering coins or small votives, and reciting prayers. Only then could they enter the abaton, the sleeping chamber. Here, in rows, pilgrims lay down on straw mats or animal skins, wrapped in blankets, and surrendered themselves to sleep. They believed that Asclepius, often accompanied by his sacred serpent, would visit them in the night. In dreams, he would whisper cures, or perform healing directly, touching the body unseen. The records left behind are curious. Stone inscriptions found at Epidaurus describe cases where a man dreamed that Asclepius cut open his belly and removed sickness, or where a woman dreamt the god applied ointment to her eyes. Upon waking, they declared themselves healed. Were these placebo effects? Were some exaggerations? Or was there perhaps a real sense that the ritual itself, the journey, the faith, the rest, gave the body what it needed? We cannot be certain, but we can say this. For the Greeks, dreams and health were inseparable. Think of how ordinary people must have felt, lying down in that vast, dark chamber. The flicker of torches dimming, the smell of incense, the rustle of bodies shifting on mats. Hundreds breathing together, waiting not just for sleep, but for a vision. The weight of expectation must have been immense. To close your eyes there was to surrender, not just to Hypnos, but to Asclepius himself. It was sleep as prayer. And yet the Greeks did not treat all dreams as sacred. They drew careful lines. Some dreams were theophanic, direct messages from gods. Others were ordinary illusions, reflections of daily concerns. The challenge lay in distinguishing them. This is where the dream interpreters gained their power. Men like Artemidorus compiled vast books of symbols, cataloging thousands of possibilities. A dream of sailing might mean prosperity. A dream of being chaste might warn of debts. But when a dream was experienced in a temple, it was elevated. No longer the muddle of the mind, but the speech of a god. You can almost feel the tension between these two views. On one hand, the human desire to categorize and explain dreams logically. On the other, the awe that they might carry divine fingerprints. And perhaps you know this feeling too. The way a dream can sometimes be brushed aside as nonsense, and yet at other times cling stubbornly, as if refusing to let go. But Greek thought about night went deeper still. The pantheon of deities tied to sleep and dreams was vast. Beyond Hypnos, there were his children, the oniroi. Chief among them was Morpheus, the shaper of forms, who could appear in dreams as human figures. He was joined by Phobator, who brought animal dreams, and Phantasos, who conjured visions of landscapes and objects. Together they filled the night with endless imagery, and behind them loomed their grandmother, Nyx, the goddess of night herself, older than even Zeus, born from the very chaos at the dawn of creation. In Greek poetry, Nyx is both fearsome and tender, cloaking the world each evening, reminding mortals of their smallness beneath the stars. To sleep, then, was to fall under the wings of an ancient lineage. First, Nyx drew her dark veil, then Hypnos came with gentle hands, and finally the Oniroi scattered their images. Even death, Thanatos, hovered nearby, reminding sleepers that each night was a rehearsal for eternity. The ordinary act of lying down in bed was, in their imagination, part of a cosmic family drama. Let us step back into the daily life of a Greek household. Beds were simple constructions, wooden frames strung with leather thongs, covered with straw mattresses or wool-stuffed sacks. Wealthier homes might have linens dyed in faint colors, poorer homes only rough blankets. Pillows, when they existed, were firm and small. The floor, cool against the skin, was often preferred in summer. Night came not all at once, but in stages. Families gathered around a small fire or lamp, told stories, shared the last food of the day, and gradually settled. Children fell asleep quickly, curled against their mothers. Adults stayed awake longer, listening to the distant noises of the polies, carts rumbling, voices fading, the occasional sound of revelry drifting in from a banquet. And when true night arrived, it brought with it both rest and fear. Greek homes had no glass windows. Doors were simple wooden slabs, often barred from within. To sleep was to make oneself vulnerable. To thieves, to fire, to the spirits the Greeks believed wandered after dark. Many placed amulets at their doorways or hung charms above beds. Some whispered protective prayers before lying down. Sleep was sought, but it was never entirely safe. Here lies an interesting parallel to the myths. Just as Hypnos could be gentle or treacherous, so too was night itself. For a farmer, it meant rest. For a guard, danger. For a mother, worry over a sick child. Sleep was necessary, but it came with risk. And perhaps that is why the Greeks gave it so many divine faces, to make sense of its double nature. As you listen now, perhaps your own room feels calmer, quieter. It is easy to imagine yourself in such a household. A faint lamp burning low, the cool night pressing against stone walls, the family around you drifting slowly into silence. And yet, even in this simplicity, there is a sense of depth. Every creak, every flicker of flame, carried meaning. Nothing in the Greek night was without significance. One cannot forget the role of dreams in politics and war. Leaders consulted oracles not only in daylight, but in their sleep. Alexander the Great, for instance, was said to have dreamt of a satyr before conquering Tyre. His advisors interpreted it as a pun, satyros, meaning Tyre is yours. Whether coincidence or invention, it reveals the cultural habit. Victories were traced back not only to strategy, but to dreams. Sleep, in this way, was stitched into the very fabric of history. And so we see how deeply intertwined sleep and belief were in the Greek world. It was never just rest. It was medicine, prophecy, ritual, and danger. It was the soft hand of Hypnos and the stern reminder of Thanatos. It was the whisper of Morpheus and the shadow of Nyx. For the Greeks, the night was alive. Yet one question lingers. Did they, lying awake in those restless hours we all know, ever doubt? Did a farmer, staring at the rafters of his house, ever wonder if perhaps no god was listening? Did a mother, grieving a child despite her temple dreams, ever lose faith? The records are silent. The inscriptions preserve only the hopeful, the miraculous. The doubts, if they existed, slipped away like forgotten dreams. And so the puzzle remains. Was Greek sleep truly divine? Or was it simply human longing dressed in sacred language? We will carry this question forward. For in the final part of this story, we will see how the Greeks' vision of sleep shaped not only their religion, but their philosophy, their science, and their legacy to us today. But before we reach that point, pause for a moment. If you are still awake, breathing steadily in the quiet, consider leaving a trace of your thoughts somewhere, as the ancients carved their dreams into stone. A simple note, a quiet comment, even a like or a share, is not so different from their old inscriptions. It tells the world, I too was here, and I too dreamed. And so we end this section under the silent gaze of Nyx. The night stretches long, the gods hover unseen, and sleep gathers strength. The question we now face is this: how did the Greeks move from myth to explanation, from sacred dreams to the first attempts at science? Section 3. We have wandered through the temples, through the chambers of Hypnos and his children, through the nightly fears of ordinary households. Yet the story of sleep in the Greek imagination is not only one of gods and rituals. As the centuries passed, thinkers began to ask a quieter, more unsettling question. What if dreams did not come from Olympus at all? What if sleep was not a divine messenger, but something rooted in the body itself? This was the path of the philosophers. For while religion and myth colored the lives of most Greeks, there were always those who sought to peel back the veil, to see what lay beneath. Hippocrates, the physician of Kos, offered some of the earliest medical thoughts on sleep. He described it not as the touch of hypnos, but as the body's natural state when heat withdrew inward. To him, dreams were not divine commands, but reflections of health. If one dreamt of rivers flooding, perhaps it meant the body's fluids were disturbed. If one dreamt of fire, it might signal fever. Dreams became, in his writings, diagnostic clues, still meaningful, but stripped of divine origin. In this way, Greek medicine began to domesticate the wild visions of the night. Aristotle, too, turned his calm gaze on the subject. In his short treatises on sleep and on dreams, he described slumber as a natural function, necessary for restoring the body. He argued that dreams were the continuation of sense impressions, lingering after the body had shut down. To him, dreams were neither messages from gods nor entirely random. They were echoes, fragments of the waking world, rearranged by the quiet mind. And yet, even in Aristotle's cool reasoning, you can feel the old awe. He admitted that sometimes dreams seemed to predict illness or warn of events. Though he did not credit the gods, he still left a space for mystery, for the strange accuracy that dreams occasionally possess. This shift from myth to science did not erase the older beliefs. Rather, the two ran side by side. A farmer might still journey to Asclepius's temple for healing dreams, while a physician might note his night visions as signs of bodily imbalance. The sacred and the rational coexisted, often in the same household, the same mind. It is a reminder that human beings rarely abandon old explanations entirely. We layer them, one upon another, seeking comfort both in gods and in reason. But Greek reflection on sleep went further still, into the realm of literature. In tragedy and epic, dreams were devices that shaped destiny. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides all wove visions into their plays. In Agamemnon, the queen Clytemnestra dreams of giving birth to a serpent, a chilling omen of the bloody events to come. In the Bacchae, Pentheus is deceived by visions that lure him to destruction. Dreams in tragedy were warnings, instruments of fate, never to be ignored. This reflects the deepest Greek view of sleep. It was not merely rest, but a doorway through which the future sometimes leaked. To sleep was to risk being touched by destiny, whether one wished it or not. The stage made this belief visible, turning private night visions into public drama. And the audience, watching by torchlight, would nod in recognition. They too had felt the strange weight of dreams. Greek poets also used sleep as metaphor. Homer compared death to a long slumber. Pindar described sleep as the twin of forgetfulness. In lyric fragments, night was praised for its peace, yet also feared for its power to hide danger. The richness of their language reveals how deeply entwined sleep was with every layer of thought, from the highest philosophy to the simplest lullaby. We must also glance at the Roman inheritance. When Greece fell under Roman power, its gods and myths traveled westward. The Romans adopted Hypnos under the name Somnus, and Thanatos became Mors. Dream temples continued, though often more formalized. The poet Ovid described the palace of Somnus, a cave deep in the underworld where Morpheus and his brothers dwelt, sending visions up to mortals. Roman generals, like their Greek counterparts, consulted dreams before battle. The fusion of Greek myth with Roman order ensured that the vision of sleep as sacred lingered for centuries. Even early Christians, though often critical of pagan gods, inherited this fascination. The Bible itself contains powerful dreams. Joseph's guidance in Egypt, Pilate's wife warning him about Christ. To later thinkers, sleep remained a channel for revelation, though its source shifted from Olympus to the Christian God. The legacy of Greek sleep had simply been recast, and yet something curious happened as centuries passed. The more philosophy and medicine developed, the more sleep was treated as biological. Galen, the Roman physician, wrote extensively on the humors and their role in dreams. Later scholars in the Middle Ages folded Greek thought into their own frameworks, blending Aristotle with Christian theology. The gods receded, but the questions remained the same. Why do we sleep? Why do we dream? Are they messages or just echoes? If you pause here, you may realize we are still asking. Modern science speaks of REM cycles, of neurons firing, of the brain processing memory. And yet, when we wake from a dream that feels oddly true, do we not still sense something more? We, like the Greeks, hesitate between reason and wonder. Now imagine yourself drifting on a quiet Aegean night. The cicadas have fallen silent. The sea laps gently against the shore. A Greek farmer lies on his straw bed, staring at the ceiling beams, waiting for sleep. Perhaps he prays to Hypnos. Perhaps he thinks of Aristotle's words. Either way, the night overtakes him. He dreams of a field, of water, of his father's voice. In the morning, he will rise and interpret it, folding the vision into his day. In that simple act, he joins the endless chain of humans who have treated sleep as more than just rest. And so, the story of Greek sleep is not finished. It is carried on in us. Each time we drift into slumber, we step into the same unknown they once revered. Each time we puzzle over a dream, we echo their debates. Hypnos may no longer be worshipped in temples, but he still touches us every night, softly, invisibly. If you are still listening, still awake at this late point, think of this. When you close your eyes tonight, you will be doing something as old as civilization itself. You will be walking the same path as Greeks and Romans, as poets and philosophers, as farmers and kings. You will be joining a story that began long before you and will continue long after. And the lingering question, the one the Greeks never answered, and that we have not solved either, is this: are our dreams simply shadows of the mind, or do they still, even now, carry whispers from the gods? Story 2. Broken Nights, the two-sleep pattern of medieval Europe. Section 1. When you lie down at night today, you probably expect one long stretch of rest, a solid 7 or 8 hours if you are lucky. But for centuries in medieval Europe, sleep was not imagined this way. People did not pass the night in one unbroken slumber. Instead, they divided it into two separate sleeps, the first sleep and the second sleep. This rhythm, once ordinary, now feels strange to us. Yet for peasants, monks, merchants, even kings, segmented sleep was the natural order of the night. Historians have uncovered countless references, in diaries, in court records, in sermons, all describing a world where waking in the middle of the night was expected, even normal. So let us travel back. Picture a medieval village, perhaps in France, perhaps in England. The sun has set hours ago. A small thatched house, one room, its hearth now glowing faintly with embers. A family has settled onto straw mattresses, parents and children huddled close under woolen blankets. Their day has been long, plowing fields, tending animals, mending tools, and sleep comes quickly. This is the first sleep. It begins soon after darkness falls, often around 8 or 9 in the evening. The house grows still, the fire sinks lower, and the night deepens. But some hours later, perhaps near midnight, perhaps closer to 1, eyes begin to open again. The family stirs. Some rise, tend the fire, whisper prayers. Others sit quietly, letting their minds wander. This is not insomnia. It is expected. The body itself, shaped by candlelight and darkness, has fallen into its natural rhythm. Between the first and second sleep lies a period of wakefulness, lasting an hour, sometimes more. Only afterward do they return to bed for the second sleep, which carries them into dawn. What did they do in those quiet hours between? Here, the sources offer us fascinating and sometimes dull details. Many used the time for prayer, especially monks whose schedules of matins and vigils required night worship. The Catholic Church structured its rhythms around this broken night, expecting the faithful to rise and pray when darkness was deepest. Others used the interval for chores. Women might spin wool or mend clothing by the hearth. Men might check on animals, chop wood, or simply sit by the fire. Couples sometimes chose this quiet hour for intimacy, believing the body was most rested and fertile after first sleep. But perhaps most common of all was reflection. Diaries describe people lying in bed awake, thinking, sometimes speaking with their families, sometimes simply drifting in half-dreams. The night, divided into two, gave them a space for stillness we hardly imagine today. In a world without screens, without electric light, time itself seemed stretched, elastic. You can almost imagine the atmosphere. A candle flickers. The house is hushed. Outside, frost coats the fields or rain taps against the roof. Inside, voices murmur softly, then fade again. In that silence, people thought of their lives, their sins, their hopes. They believed dreams from the first sleep might reveal truths, and that wakefulness afterward gave them time to interpret, to weigh, to pray. Night was not just for rest. It was for the soul. The practice reached all levels of society. In noble households, too, people rose between sleeps. Servants stoked fires. Priests prayed in chapels. Lords sometimes held discussions or wrote letters in these hours. In castles, guards rotated shifts while their masters sat awake in the half-light. It was not considered unusual. It was the rhythm of the age. One historian, Roger E. Kirk, combed through thousands of references and found that first sleep and second sleep were phrases used casually, as if everyone understood them. Court records from 16th century France mention servants committing theft after the first sleep. In England, ballads speak of lovers meeting betwixt the first and second sleep. The language itself reveals how ordinary this pattern was. Why, then, did people sleep this way? The answer seems tied to the simple absence of artificial light. In a world lit only by sun, moon, and fire, darkness stretched long in winter, 14 hours or more. Few could sleep that entire span. The body, left to its own rhythms, naturally divided the night. Modern experiments in sleep labs where volunteers live in artificial darkness show the same thing. After weeks, people fall into segmented sleep, with a calm, wakeful period in the middle. It seems to be our ancient natural rhythm. Think about that for a moment. Perhaps, if you sometimes wake in the night, staring at the ceiling, restless, it is not a flaw at all. It may be your body remembering something older, something medieval, something deeply human. If this thought comforts you, perhaps whisper it to yourself tonight. Or, if you're still awake later, leave a note, a quiet comment, saying whether you've ever felt your own first sleep and second sleep. The villagers of old would smile to know their rhythm still lingers. But segmented sleep was not only practical, it carried meaning. Priests preached that the hours between sleeps were sacred, a time when the veil between earth and heaven was thinner. Many confessions and sermons urged people to use the time for prayer, to examine their souls. Some even feared the interval, believing the devil was active in darkness, whispering temptations to half-awake minds. Mothers told stories of spirits roaming, of witches gathering. Thus, the waking hours could be peaceful or unsettling, holy or haunted, depending on how one filled them. Monks institutionalized this rhythm in their cloisters. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, required night prayers at fixed times. Bells would ring, monks would shuffle to the chapel, chanting psalms by candlelight. Afterward, some returned to bed for second sleep, while others remained in meditation. The entire structure of monastic life was built upon the broken night. And through the church, this rhythm spread across Europe, shaping households and villages alike. The practical details are almost touching in their simplicity. In many homes, the hearth was rekindled during the waking hours, both for warmth and light. Coals were stirred, a small flame coaxed up, bread perhaps toasted, broth reheated. Families sometimes shared small snacks, a handful of nuts, a sip of ale. The night watch, too, fell in these hours, men pacing the village, checking gates, ensuring no fire spread. For them, the broken night was duty as much as habit. And always, dreams lingered. Dreams from the first sleep were thought stronger, more vivid. They were interpreted seriously, sometimes discussed aloud during the waking interval. People might ask, did that dream mean illness, fortune, warning? By the time second sleep came, dreams were lighter, fainter, less trusted. The night itself was divided not only by time, but by the quality of visions. It is striking how different this feels from our modern lives. Today, we compress night into one stretch, chasing efficiency, measuring rest by hours. But medieval people lived more slowly, more flexibly. Their night stretched and breathed, full of quiet tasks, whispered prayers, secret thoughts. We might ask, was this broken night better? Did it give them a space for reflection we have lost? Or was it, instead, a burden, a constant interruption in their rest? Sources disagree. Some describe the hours fondly, as peaceful. Others hint at frustration, at dangers that lurked when lamps burned low. And so we end this first step into the medieval night. The villagers return to their second sleep. The monks finish their psalms. The noble lords put away their letters. Across Europe, the rhythm holds steady. First sleep, wakeful hour, second sleep. The question now is this: how did such a universal pattern, written into language and habit, eventually vanish from our lives? Section 2. In the first part of this story, we drifted into the quiet rhythm of medieval nights, the slow arc of first sleep, the waking interval, and then the return to second sleep. This pattern endured for centuries. It shaped not only daily life but also imagination, religion, and the language itself. And yet, it did not last forever. By the early modern era, whispers of change were stirring. A new night was dawning, one that would gradually erase the idea of segmented sleep from memory. Why did this happen? How could something so ordinary, so ingrained, simply vanish? The answer lies in a convergence of forces, some material, some cultural. Light, commerce, medicine, even fear, all reshaped the way people thought about the hours of darkness. Let us begin with the simplest: light itself. For medieval villagers, darkness was overwhelming. Winter nights stretched long, 14 or even 15 hours in northern Europe. With only the flicker of tallow candles, the glow of hearths, or the occasional rushlight dipped in grease, there was little choice but to surrender to the rhythms of darkness. Sleep broke naturally into two parts, divided by wakeful stillness. But as centuries passed, sources of light improved. In towns, the wealthy could afford beeswax candles, which burned brighter and longer. Oil lamps became more common, filling halls with steady flames. Later, in the 17th century, some cities introduced rudimentary street lighting, lanterns hanging above thoroughfares in Paris, Amsterdam, and London. Suddenly, the night was not so absolute. Streets were no longer entirely surrendered to blackness. Markets, taverns, and gatherings stretched later into the evening. The line between day and night blurred, and with it, the need for two sleeps began to fade. But light was only one force. The growth of towns and trade also shifted patterns. In rural villages, life still bent to the seasons. Yet in cities, where taverns bustled and workshops hummed, night gained a different character. Merchants worked late, apprentices caroused. Theaters opened their doors after sunset. The night became social, communal, even commercial. In this new environment, long stretches of restlessness between sleeps were less desirable. People wanted unbroken rest so they could work longer, trade harder, or simply enjoy evening amusements. Medical authorities began to notice, too. By the 17th and 18th centuries, advice literature shifted. Doctors increasingly encouraged consolidated sleep, warning that night waking could disturb the humors, those delicate fluids thought to govern health. Here we see the strange entanglement of science and society. For centuries, physicians had accepted segmented sleep as natural. Dreams after first sleep, they said, were powerful, while those after second sleep were lighter. But as urban life demanded efficiency, medicine adapted. New treatises declared that long, uninterrupted rest was preferable. Waking in the middle of the night was redefined, not as ordinary, but as problematic, a sign of illness, of nerves, of weakness. The transformation crept into literature as well. Earlier ballads and plays had casually mentioned first and second sleep, as though every listener knew the rhythm. But by the 18th century, such references faded. Night became a single block, sleep a singular act. By the Victorian era, to wake at midnight was a cause for worry, a whisper of insomnia. And so an ancient habit was forgotten, replaced by a new ideal. Yet traces of the old world lingered. In rural districts, far from urban clocks, peasants still spoke of first and second sleep well into the 1800s. Travelers' accounts from southern Italy and rural Ireland describe households rising in the night, chatting by the hearth, then returning to bed. But these remnants dwindled, swept aside by industrialization and the rigid schedules it imposed. Factories demanded punctuality. Railways sliced time into precise schedules. The elasticity of the night was no longer tolerated. Efficiency demanded straight lines, not curves. There is also the matter of fear. In the Middle Ages, the hours between sleeps were often filled with prayer or reflection, but also with unease. Darkness, they believed, was a liminal time. Witches, demons, and restless souls were thought to wander. Many sermons warned against idleness in these hours, urging believers to resist temptation. The devil, priests said, prowled at midnight. And yet people lived with this fear, accepting the broken night as inevitable. But in later centuries, when the very idea of progress gained power, fear transformed. To rise at midnight was not merely spiritually dangerous, it was socially suspicious. What respectable person was awake when others slept? The ideal became simple. Go to bed late, wake in the morning, waste no time in between. Segmented sleep, once holy, was now unseemly. If we look closer at the domestic details, we can trace this cultural change. In medieval England, court documents sometimes noted crimes occurring after the first sleep. By the 17th century, such language vanished. Instead, records describe actions at midnight or in the night, reflecting a new assumption. Sleep was whole, not broken. Language itself recorded the shift. Imagine a family around 1300, rising after first sleep. They tend the fire, sip weak ale, murmur prayers. Now imagine their descendants in 1700, living in a city apartment. Outside, oil lamps flicker on the street. Neighbors chat late into the night, laughter drifting upward. This family does not wake after first sleep. They sleep through, resting until morning, for the rhythm of their world has changed. And yet, not all welcomed this change. Some lamented the loss of the midnight hours. A few diarists of the 18th century describe fondly the time they once had to themselves. Quiet, private, away from the demands of daylight. In a sense, modern people traded one kind of night for another. They gained longer evenings of activity, but they lost that gentle, reflective interval, that space for dreams and silence. We can also consider how religion evolved in relation to this. Monastic schedules remained rigid, with vigils and matins punctuating the night. But outside cloisters, devotion shifted. By the Enlightenment, religion no longer structured the daily hours as tightly. Rational order, not spiritual rhythm, became the guide. The holy stillness between first and second sleep grew less relevant, less practiced. A strange irony emerges here. In our own day, many complain of sleeplessness, of waking in the night, of tossing and turning. Doctors diagnose insomnia, prescribe remedies, recommend strict routines. And yet, what these sufferers experience may be nothing more than a shadow of the old pattern, a memory of segmented sleep buried deep in human biology. We worry about what our ancestors accepted calmly. They expected to wake. We dread it. Perhaps this is why the rediscovery of segmented sleep in modern scholarship feels so startling. In the 1990s, historian Roger Ekirch published his research, and readers were astonished to learn that for centuries, humanity slept in two parts. The story was picked up in newspapers, books, even documentaries. It seemed almost unbelievable, and yet the evidence was overwhelming. The broken night had been our inheritance for millennia. If you've ever woken at 2 or 3 in the morning, sitting in quiet frustration, consider this. You may be closer to a medieval villager than you realize. Your restless mind, your wandering thoughts, your half-dreaming wakefulness. These are echoes of first sleep and second sleep. And perhaps, if you've listened this far, you might even whisper a thought into the quiet. Would you rather return to such a rhythm, or do you prefer the unbroken sleep our world now demands? Feel free to share your thoughts gently, as though leaving a note in the margin of history itself. But the story of segmented sleep is not finished. There remains one more chapter to explore. What does this forgotten rhythm tell us about the larger relationship between humans and the night? Did we lose something essential when we surrendered to artificial light and the demands of industry? Or did we gain more than we lost? The answers lie in the next part of our journey. Section 3. By the dawn of the 19th century, the two-sleep pattern, once the quiet backbone of medieval nights, had nearly disappeared. In bustling cities and even in rural villages, the rhythm of first sleep and second sleep gave way to a single, unbroken slumber. Few remembered it. Fewer still practiced it. The very idea had slipped from common memory, as though it had never existed at all. How could something so ordinary vanish so completely? The answer, in truth, is not surprising. Industrialization reshaped not only work, but time itself. Factories demanded precision. Whistles and bells rang at dawn. Workers marched into crowded floors, and any habit that disrupted productivity was pressed down. The long, reflective, wakeful hour between sleeps had no place in this new world. Efficiency was king. Rest was a resource. Sleep became not a rhythm, but a block, something to be measured, regulated, and controlled. Alongside industry came new technologies. Gas lamps flooded cities with light. By the mid-19th century, entire streets glowed into the evening. Shops stayed open late. Newspapers could be printed overnight. The darkness itself, once deep, thick, almost sacred, was broken apart. For the first time in human history, night was not governed by the moon or the fire. It was human-made. In this new brightness, the gentle middle hours between sleeps lost their meaning. Why wake when the evening was already lively? Why rise at midnight when the true activity of the day was extended into the night? Slowly, people forgot the interval that had once been natural. They spoke instead of a good night's sleep, meaning a single stretch, nothing more. Yet the human body is stubborn. It remembers rhythms older than industry, older than cities. Even as society embraced consolidated sleep, many still woke in the night. They tossed, they turned, they rose from bed. But instead of seeing it as natural, they called it insomnia. Doctors prescribed tonics. Remedies were advertised in newspapers. A habit once ordinary became a problem to be solved. The language changed, and with it, the meaning of the night. But we can still glimpse the ghost of segmented sleep today. Consider the shift worker, rising at odd hours, catching rest in broken stretches. Consider the parent of a newborn, whose nights are fractured into cycles of waking and dozing. Consider the traveler crossing time zones, or the student falling asleep at dusk only to wake at midnight. These patterns are not failures. They are reminders of an older rhythm, an echo of the medieval night. Even more common are the quiet hours of wakefulness many still experience. 2 in the morning. 3. You wake unexpectedly and find yourself staring at the ceiling. The world is silent. Anxiety may creep in, but what if, instead, you thought of it differently? What if you imagined you were simply sharing in the rhythm of villagers centuries ago, stirring from first sleep, lingering in the stillness, waiting for second sleep to come? You are not broken. You are remembering. There is a gentleness in this perspective. Perhaps, in some ways, the medieval night offered a gift. Those waking hours were not wasted. They were used for prayer, for thought, for whispered conversation. They were a time to sit with one's own mind, to confront silence without fear. In our own world, so full of constant noise, perhaps there is wisdom in reclaiming a fragment of that stillness. Yet we must also admit what was gained. Artificial light gave people freedom. Industry gave comfort, security, and progress. Unbroken sleep allows the body to heal, to grow, to restore. Medical research shows that consolidated rest is beneficial in many ways. The past, for all its poetry, was not always better. People suffered from cold, from hunger, from danger in the night. The broken sleep was part of that world. a world less safe, less certain, less forgiving. So we are left with a delicate balance. Something was lost. Something was gained. The long, quiet midnight gave way to bustling evenings of laughter, to morning trains and factory bells, to the very world you live in now. And yet, deep in the marrow of human biology, the two-sleep pattern lingers. It rises in your restless nights. It whispers in your sudden awakenings. Historians call it segmented sleep. Medieval people called it simply first sleep and second sleep. But perhaps you might think of it as a bridge, a reminder that the way we sleep is not fixed, not eternal, but shaped by culture, by technology, by the turning of history itself. And so, the next time you wake in the small hours, when the room is dark and the world is hushed, pause for a moment before reaching for worry. Imagine instead that you are keeping company with monks in their chapels, with peasants by their hearths, with nobles whispering in castle halls. Across centuries, you are joined by countless souls who stirred from first sleep, thought quietly, prayed, dreamed, and returned to bed. You are not alone in the night. You are part of an ancient rhythm. And as dawn approaches, as second sleep fades and the sky lightens, you may wonder, did we abandon segmented sleep, or did it abandon us? Was it merely a phase of history, or is it still hidden within us, waiting to emerge when the lights go out, when silence falls? That question lingers unanswered in the quiet of the night. Story 3. The Monastic Clock, Bells, Prayers, and Interrupted Rest, section. If you lived in a medieval monastery, your night was not your own. It belonged to the bell. The toll of the bell cut through darkness, steady, insistent, calling men from their beds. It was not the sun that ruled their hours, nor the seasons, nor even their own tired bodies. It was the rhythm of prayer. The monastic clock, measured not in minutes, but in psalms. For monks across Europe, sleep was always interrupted. This was by design. To follow the rule of Saint Benedict, the guiding code for monastic life since the 6th century, was to surrender to a life divided, ordered, disciplined. Sleep, like work, like food, was never taken in abundance. It was rationed, broken apart, interrupted by duty to God. Picture the scene. A stone abbey in northern France around the year 1200. The cloister is cold, the walls damp with night air. Outside, frost lingers on the fields. Within, a small group of men stirs from straw pallets. The bell has rung. It is the hour of matins, the night office. Cloaks are thrown over shoulders, sandals slipped on bare feet. In silence, with only flickering candles to light the way, they shuffle toward the chapel. Their eyes are heavy, but their lips are already shaping prayers. This was the reality of monastic time. The day and night were divided into a sequence of canonical hours, fixed moments of prayer and worship. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Each was a station on a wheel that turned endlessly, day after day. To live in a monastery was to give yourself entirely to this cycle. The bell rang, and you obeyed. For most monks, the hardest moment was matins. It came deep in the night, long after first sleep, but long before dawn. Some abbeys rose at midnight, others at 2 in the morning. The exact hour varied, but the principle was constant. Even sleep must bend to devotion. Matins could last for hours. Monks would chant psalms, listen to readings, bow in silence, sometimes kneel on cold stone floors. Their bodies longed for rest, but their duty was prayer. When the service ended, some returned to their beds for a brief second sleep before the next office, while others remained awake, studying scripture or meditating. And so the rhythm of rest was never smooth. It was always fragmented, bent around the bell. If you are listening to this now, perhaps in the quiet of your own night, consider how different their world was. We measure time by clocks, glowing screens, buzzing alarms. They measured it by bells and by obedience. A single ring in the dark could wrench them from slumber. And yet they accepted it. They believed this broken rhythm brought them closer to God. It is easy to forget how radical the monastic system was in shaping the very idea of time. In most medieval villages, people lived by nature's cues. They rose with dawn, worked by daylight, slept when darkness fell. Their schedules bent with the seasons, longer days in summer, shorter in winter. But monks lived by the bell, by the unchanging cycle of hours. It was perhaps the first strict timetable in Europe. Centuries before, factories and railways imposed similar order on the wider world. And it was relentless. 7 or 8 times a day, every day the bell rang. Monks interrupted their labor, in fields, in kitchens, in scriptoria where they copied manuscripts, to pray. They interrupted their meals. They interrupted their conversations. And yes, they interrupted their sleep. To modern ears, this may sound harsh, even inhuman, but for those who joined monasteries, it was considered a path to holiness. To deny the body's craving for comfort was to discipline the soul. Interrupted sleep was not a flaw. It was a sacrifice. Of course, the practical details tell another story. Monks often dozed during readings, heads nodding forward as scripture droned on. In some abbeys, rules were written forbidding sleeping during the office, evidence that it happened often enough to need regulation. In winter, monks shivered through the night services, their breath visible in the frigid air. Chroniclers mention elderly brothers who struggled to rise, who shuffled slowly, leaning on canes. The ideal of constant vigilance often met the reality of weary bodies. And yet, the system endured. For centuries, abbeys across Europe maintained this rhythm. It structured not only their own lives but also those of the surrounding communities. Villagers often heard the bells, marking hours they themselves did not keep. To live near a monastery was to live near a soundscape of time. The tolling through darkness, the call at dawn, the chant at dusk. The bells were not only spiritual, they were practical markers too. Farmers might note the timing of prime or terce to plan their work. Travelers arriving at monasteries for shelter could predict the routine by the sound of lauds or compline. In a world with few mechanical clocks, the monastery itself was a kind of living timekeeper. But what did this mean for sleep? It meant that monks lived in a permanent state of interruption. Their nights were never whole. They dozed lightly, always alert for the bell. They rose in darkness, returned to bed, woke again. Some scholars describe it as a constant negotiation between body and duty. Enough sleep to function, never enough to indulge. If you think about it, this pattern echoed the two-sleep rhythm we explored earlier in village life. But in the monastery, it was enforced. Where peasants woke naturally, monks were compelled. Where villagers might use the night for reflection, monks were told precisely what to do with those hours: prayer, chant, devotion. What was spontaneous in the village was regulated in the cloister. It raises a curious thought. Did monks truly experience greater holiness in these waking intervals? Or did they simply endure exhaustion? Were the bells a bridge to heaven, or merely chains binding them to ritual? The chronicles are silent on how they felt, for humility forbade complaints. But we can imagine their weariness, their heavy eyes, their whispered yawns in the cold chapel. Perhaps tonight, as you drift, you might reflect. What would it be like if your sleep were not your own? If a bell called you, again and again, through the night, would you accept it as duty? Or would you rebel? You might leave a quiet thought later, a reflection of how you'd manage such a life, not as a grand debate, but as a whisper, like a monk scribbling notes in the margin of a worn manuscript. For now, though, let us leave the monks in their chapel, chanting by candlelight, while the rest of the world sleeps. Their time is ordered, their rest divided, their souls bent toward God. But as we'll see in the next part, The monastic clock was not only about sleep, it shaped the wider history of time itself. The question that lingers is this: did the discipline of the monastery give birth to the discipline of modern life? Was the constant interruption of sleep in cloisters the seed from which our own strict schedules grew? Section 2. The tolling of bells in the night was only one part of monastic discipline. The cycle did not end at dawn. It repeated, hour after hour, weaving together a day that belonged not to the monk, but to the rhythm of prayer. To live in a monastery was to live inside a timetable, one of the earliest strict timetables in Europe. Each canonical hour demanded attention. At prime, just after sunrise, the bell called again. At terce, mid-morning. Sext, at noon. None in mid-afternoon. Vespers, at sunset. And finally compline, before retiring to bed. No task was so important it could not be interrupted. A monk might be copying a manuscript, milking cows, brewing ale, or tending the garden. The bell rang, and he set it aside. God first, body second. This rhythm may sound harsh, but to medieval Christians, it was a path of devotion. To obey the bell was to resist the self. Each interruption was a reminder. Life was not yours to control. It was entrusted to God. The very fragmentation of sleep and labor was part of the lesson. The bell was a teacher, shaping humility. But how did the body endure this? Records suggest that monks rarely enjoyed long, restorative rest. Instead, they lived in fragments. 2 or 3 hours of sleep at night, broken by matins, followed by another short stretch, and perhaps a nap later in the day. Benedictine rules technically allowed for siestas in warmer climates, though northern monasteries were less forgiving. Chronic weariness was expected. Visitors noticed. Travelers to monasteries sometimes remarked on the pale faces of monks, the slow pace of their movements. Some saw holiness in this. Bodies weakened so that souls might grow strong. Others saw something pitiable. Men drained by relentless schedule. One chronicler wrote of monks wandering as shadows, their eyes heavy, yet their lips in prayer. And yet, paradoxically, monasteries thrived. Despite their fatigue, monks were productive. They farmed, brewed beer, produced manuscripts, offered charity, and ran schools. How could they accomplish so much on so little sleep? Perhaps discipline itself was the answer. By binding life so tightly to ritual, every moment had purpose. Nothing was wasted. Time became a sacred resource. Outside the cloister walls, peasants lived differently. They rose with the sun, worked fields by daylight, and slept more freely. Yet the monastery shaped their time as well. The bells carried across valleys, calling not only monks but entire villages to awareness. Even if peasants did not attend matins, they heard its sound. Vespers reminded them of evening. Compline marked the day's close. In many places, monasteries were the loudest and most reliable timekeepers of the region. This influence grew stronger with the arrival of mechanical clocks. The earliest weight-driven clocks in Europe were installed not in towns, but in monasteries, often to help regulate the canonical hours more precisely. By the 14th century, abbeys like St. Albans in England and Cluny in France boasted impressive clock mechanisms. The steady tick and chime reinforced the power of the bell. The monastic schedule, once tied loosely to natural cycles, became exact. Time itself was tamed. Gradually, towns adopted these devices. Clock towers rose above marketplaces, ringing out hours to merchants, bakers, blacksmiths. What began in the monastery spread into the fabric of society, and so the discipline of monks, their fragmented rest, their obedience to bells, seeped outward, shaping how all of Europe began to imagine time. But let us return to the monks themselves. What was it like to wake in darkness, night after night, summoned by bells to matins? Some embraced it. For them, the silence of the midnight chapel was profound. A closeness to God felt most deeply when the world outside slept. Candlelight flickered on stone arches, chants echoed in cold air, and in that stillness they believed heaven drew near. Others, though, struggled. Records of monastic rules reveal constant warnings against laxity. Monks falling asleep in the choir, skipping offices, or dragging their feet to chapel. Punishments were mild but firm. Extra prayers, fasting, penance. The body might falter, but discipline must endure. If you imagine yourself there, how would you respond? Would you rise dutifully at the first toll, wrapping your cloak tightly, shuffling into the cold? Or would you linger in bed, wishing the bell silent? Perhaps whisper your answer in your own way, quietly, like a monk's note scribbled in the corner of a psalter. The bell's authority was immense. It did not ask, it commanded. And yet, paradoxically, monks themselves created this system. They chose this life, or at least embraced it once inside. In doing so, they shaped not only their own days, but the very idea of time in the West. The idea that hours could be divided precisely, that tasks could be measured, that discipline could structure life down to the minute, all of this flowed outward from the cloister. We sometimes think of monasteries as isolated, cut off from the world. In truth, they were engines of culture. Their bells echoed into villages. Their clocks inspired towns. Their disciplined timekeeping influenced merchants, schools, and eventually factories. Long before the Industrial Revolution, monks lived by a clock, not mechanical at first, but spiritual. And at the heart of it all was interrupted sleep. The willingness to wake in darkness, to break the body's natural rhythm for prayer, was more than devotion. It was a statement. Time itself belonged to God, not to man. But what, we might ask, did it cost them? Did the weariness deepen their piety, or did it dull their minds? Did they find holiness in broken nights, or only exhaustion? History rarely records their private thoughts. We see only glimpses, warnings against sleeping in chapel, stories of monks found dozing at desks. Their fatigue is present, but their acceptance stronger. Perhaps the greatest paradox of the monastic clock is that it shaped the world far beyond cloister walls. The very discipline that fragmented monks' nights helped build a culture that values punctuality, precision, and regularity, qualities that define modern life. In this sense, their sacrifice of sleep was not wasted. It set a pattern the world would follow. And so we are left with a quiet question. Did the monks of old, rising at midnight in candlelit chapels, unknowingly prepare the way for the schedules we live by today? The trains, the schools, the work days. Did their interrupted rest give birth to the strict timetables that now shape every aspect of our world? The bells fade for now, but the echo lingers. Section 3. When we think of a monastery, we often imagine seclusion, walls that keep the world out, silence that muffles earthly noise. Yet in truth, monasteries were not sealed chambers. They were beacons of sound. The toll of their bells, the rhythm of their hours, reached far beyond cloister gates. What monks practiced in private became public, reshaping the habits of entire regions. The transformation began subtly. A peasant tending his sheep might pause when he heard the noontime bell, not to pray but simply to mark the day's center. A merchant passing through a town with a monastery might time his meal to the rhythm of vespers. And when mechanical clocks began to strike more precisely, they reinforced this pattern. Time was no longer merely the rising and setting of the sun, or the turning of the seasons. Time became sliced into smaller, measurable units. This shift had consequences. Medieval life before the spread of monastic order was flexible. Villagers woke when the sky lightened, ate when hungry, slept when tired. Work followed the weather, harvest required long days, winter permitted rest. The monastery disrupted that fluidity. It offered a template of discipline, hours fixed, tasks divided, days structured. Even if peasants did not imitate the monastic routine, they absorbed its presence. Bells were hard to ignore, The psychological weight of bells cannot be overstated. For a monk, each toll was not only a call, but a command. It reminded him that life was not his own to arrange. His body's needs, his private desires, even his sleep patterns were secondary. Time itself was consecrated. But for townsfolk outside, the sound carried different meanings. A bell could mark danger, fire, or gathering. It could call markets to open or close. Over centuries, bells became the heartbeat of communities. What began as spiritual regulation of monks became civic regulation of towns. The irony is plain. Monks sacrificed rest for the sake of prayer, yet their discipline laid foundations for the punctuality demanded by merchants and governments. Their interrupted nights led to the very precision that defines modern workdays. In the quiet corridors of medieval abbeys, the future shape of time was forged. Inside monasteries, however, life was not abstract. It was weary and tangible. Imagine a winter's night. Snow presses against the cloister walls. The dormitory is dim and cold. A bell clangs at midnight. Monks stir, groaning quietly. Cloaks are pulled close, bare feet find wooden sandals. They shuffle down corridors to the chapel. There, candles flicker, breath clouds in the air, chants rise and fall. Eyes droop, but voices persist. After an hour, the service ends. They return to bed, only to rise again at dawn. Night after night, year after year, this pattern continued. How did it shape their inner lives? Did they find serenity in surrendering to the bell? Or did they carry hidden resentment? Some may have found deep comfort in the predictability. No decision needed making. Life unfolded according to sacred rhythm. Others surely felt frustration. Records hinted complaints of exhaustion, of monks caught napping in fields or leaning drowsily on choir stalls. Yet the system endured, century after century. Human frailty was expected, but discipline was valued more. Beyond the cloister, mechanical innovation marched onward. By the 14th and 15th centuries, clock towers dominated town skylines. Their hourly chimes echoed what had once been monastic hours. The idea of regulating human activity by bells was now civic, even secular. Market stalls opened on the hour. Workers reported at set times. Courts and councils followed fixed schedules. A society once led by the rhythms of nature began to move by the rhythm of machines. In this sense, monasteries unintentionally prepared Europe for modernity. Their insistence on interrupting sleep, fragmenting rest, and binding daily tasks to strict bells helped nurture the culture of exactness we know today. Schools, armies, factories, and even railways would one day inherit this legacy. The world of timetables, so ordinary to us, had roots in the broken nights of monks. Yet there is a quiet tragedy too. For while discipline flourished, freedom waned. Where once sleep came in its natural cycles, now it bent to bells. Where once meals and tasks flowed with hunger or harvest, now they obeyed the clock. Time became less about human need, more about regulation. The price of order was the loss of fluidity. Perhaps you feel that echo still. The alarm clock by your bed, the schedule on your phone, the meetings and deadlines that divide your days, all are distant cousins of those midnight bells. You may not live in a cloister, but you too live by a timetable not entirely your own. The monastic legacy endures, woven into the very fabric of our lives. And yet, there is something strangely comforting in this continuity. To rise when called, to mark hours with routine, to live inside a rhythm larger than oneself, these practices gave monks a sense of meaning. Perhaps we too find meaning in our calendars, our shifts, our shared schedules. The bells of old still toll, only in different forms. As we close this story, one thought lingers. Did the monks, stumbling into candlelit chapels at midnight, know what they were building? Did they sense that their weary obedience to bells would shape centuries, guiding not only prayers, but commerce, governance, and the entire modern world? The monastery is quiet now. Its walls may crumble, its bells fall silent, but the sound carries on, not in stone towers, but in the ticking of watches, the ringing of alarms, the structuring of our very days. The monastic clock never truly ended. It lives quietly inside us all. Story 4. The Sailor's Rest. Sleeping at Sea in the Age of Exploration. Section 1. The Open Sea. Endless waves rolling beneath a wooden hull, winds tugging at canvas sails, and the creak of timber groaning against the pressure of the deep. To step aboard a ship during the age of exploration was to leave behind the familiar rhythms of life on land. The steady cycle of sunrise and sunset, the warmth of hearth and bed, the silence of night. At sea, sleep was not simple. It was fragile, fragmented, and often uncomfortable. When we picture the great voyages, Columbus crossing the Atlantic, Magellan circling the globe, Drake raiding Spanish ports, we often imagine adventure, glory, discovery. But for the sailors whose hands hauled the ropes and whose backs bent at the oars, life was far less romantic. It was damp clothing, salted rations, vermin, and sleepless nights. The rest of a sailor was not true rest at all, but a negotiation with noise, movement, and constant vigilance. On land, a peasant might fall asleep after a day in the fields, his head on a straw pillow, his body stretched on a wooden bed or simple mattress. At sea, the sailor had no such luxury. In the cramped hold of a ship, sleeping spaces were scarce. Some vessels provided wooden platforms or shared bunks. Others left men to rest on coils of rope, barrels, or the bare planks of the deck. By the mid-16th century, the hammock began to appear, a canvas sling tied between beams. To modern ears, a hammock may sound almost idyllic, but aboard a ship it was a necessity, not a comfort. The hammock swung with the ship, cradling the sailor against sudden rolls that might otherwise send him crashing to the floor. Even so, hammocks were narrow, damp, and crowded close together. Imagine a row of 30 men suspended shoulder to shoulder, swaying in unison as the ship pitched. The air was thick with sweat, smoke from lanterns, and the scent of unwashed bodies. Vermin scurried freely. Rats fattened on crumbs, lice hidden in clothing, cockroaches clinging to beams. Sleep came, if at all, in short bursts. And then there was the noise. A ship never grew quiet. The sea slapped against the hull, ropes strained against masts, timbers groaned, and above it all the wind howled. Crewmen moved constantly, stamping boots on the deck. Commands were shouted, sails hauled, barrels rolled. Even when the watch changed at midnight or dawn, the movement did not cease. Silence was foreign to the sailor's ear. Most difficult of all was the watch system. Aboard nearly every vessel, sailors lived by watches, rotating shifts that divided day and night into sections of duty and rest. A man might stand watch for 4 hours, scanning the waves, manning ropes, or guarding the tiller, only to crawl into his hammock for another 4 hours of uneasy sleep before being summoned again. The body never fell into a full night's rest. Instead, it staggered forward in fragments, always half alert, always prepared to rise. Exhaustion was not an exception. It was the sailor's constant companion. Consider, too, the weather. On calm seas, the hammock swayed gently, and perhaps a sailor managed a moment of true slumber. But in storms, rest was nearly impossible. Rain leaked through decks, water pooled on the floor, waves tossed the ship violently. Men clung to beams, praying the vessel would not split apart. In such nights, sleep vanished entirely. The ocean itself dictated when eyes could close. Food played its role as well. Salted beef, ship's biscuit, dried peas, all were monotonous and often spoiled. Scurvy crept in during long voyages, leaving men weak, gums bleeding, bodies aching. To rest with hunger gnawing or sickness spreading was no rest at all. Some sailors collapsed in their hammocks, too weary to rise. Others lay awake, stomachs churning. listening to the groans of companions. Yet, amid this hardship, men adapted. They learned to fall asleep quickly, to ignore the press of bodies and the squeak of ropes. A sailor could close his eyes within minutes, sinking into slumber before the next order came. Their bodies adjusted to broken rhythms, snatching rest where it could be found. Some even grew fond of the hammock's sway, finding in its motion a strange lullaby, the sea rocking them to dreams. Still, dreams themselves were troubled. Diaries and sailors' journals record visions of home, of family left behind, of warm meals and quiet hearths. Others dreamed of storms, monsters, or the endless horizon that seemed to stretch without end. Sleep at sea was never fully safe. The mind carried the burdens of the voyage into its hidden chambers. Now, pause a moment and imagine yourself aboard such a ship. You step below deck, the lantern flickering in smoky air. Hammocks line the beams, sailors already swaying gently, some snoring, some murmuring in their sleep. You tie your own hammock, climb in, and let the ship rock beneath you. The air is close, the wood damp, the noise constant, but exhaustion presses you down. You drift, half asleep, half aware, knowing at any moment a bell may ring, a voice may shout, a storm may break. Would you find rest here, or only waiting? And if you've drifted this far in our story tonight, perhaps you too might be swaying, your own thoughts rocking like hammocks in the dark. If your eyes grow heavy, you can leave your thoughts behind later. A quiet word, a like, even a small share. And then let yourself drift onward, just as sailors once did on the restless sea. The age of exploration was built on such fragile rest. Great discoveries depended on weary men, rocking in hammocks, snatching sleep in fragments. The maps and routes that reshaped the world were drawn not only by captains and kings, but by sailors whose nights were broken, whose dreams were brief, whose bodies bent to the rhythm of the sea. But even in this first glimpse, a question lingers. How did such men endure months, sometimes years, of sleepless discomfort? What toll did the sea's restless rhythm take on their health, their minds, their very survival? And how did they keep going, when every night seemed as weary as the last? Section 2. Life at sea demanded endurance, but the body has its limits. To live in fragments of rest, never sinking into the long, deep currents of sleep, slowly eroded strength. Sailors carried this weariness in their bones, in their eyes, in the sluggishness of their limbs. It was not simply that they were tired, they were altered. Exhaustion made even simple tasks treacherous. A rope coiled wrongly could snarl a sail. A slip on the wet deck could mean falling into the sea, never to be seen again. We read of sailors nodding off while on duty, eyes closing against their will, heads jerking upright at the bark of an officer. Some fell asleep at the tiller, others while standing lookout, punished not only for negligence but for weakness, as though fatigue were a failing of will, not a condition of survival. The watch system ensured that sleep was never enough. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, this pattern dominated many voyages. Some ships varied the length to prevent the same men from always keeping the same miserable hours, but the principle remained. The night belonged to duty first, rest second. The bell, like the monastic bell we encountered in our last story, cut into the natural rhythm of the body. The sailor, like the monk, was ruled by a schedule beyond his control. But while monks sought holiness, sailors sought survival. Their obedience was not voluntary piety but enforced discipline. Officers demanded alertness. Captains could not risk a distracted crew in the midst of storm or battle. Punishment for disobedience, even when rooted in exhaustion, could be severe. Flogging was common. A sailor caught sleeping on duty might be tied to the mast and whipped, or deprived of his next ration. There are accounts of men forced to stand for hours in the sun as penance, their eyelids drooping while others jeered. Sleep was precious, but it could also be weaponized. Disease worsened everything. On voyages that stretched for months, sometimes years, the ship became a floating laboratory of suffering. Scurvy, the scourge of the seas, ate away at gums and joints, leaving men crippled and pale. Dysentery spread easily in cramped quarters. Fever, lice, and infected wounds all took their toll. To sleep in such conditions was nearly impossible. The coughing of one man disturbed the rest of a dozen. The groans of the sick echoed in the night. Rats gnawed at supplies, sometimes even at the clothing of men too weak to stir. The air below decks grew thick with stench. Sweat, salt, sickness mingled together. In that fetid dark, hammocks swayed not with rest, but with fevered dreams. Yet the human body is strangely resilient. Sailors adapted. Some developed the ability to sleep anywhere, curled on a coil of rope, stretched on a barrel, even leaning against a wall in brief moments between tasks. Others relied on ritual, humming a tune before sleep, saying a prayer, or carving small charms into wood. Faith was a companion. Crosses, tokens, and whispered prayers often traveled with them into their hammocks. Many believed that sleep left them vulnerable to the sea's spirits, so charms and rituals were meant not only for comfort, but for protection. Superstition was woven into their rest. Some men swore that whistling before sleep brought storms. Others refused to sleep beneath certain beams, convinced those spots were cursed. A falling star, glimpsed before turning in, might mean death before morning. To modern ears, these sound like sailors' tales. But aboard a fragile wooden ship on a restless ocean, the line between myth and reality blurred. Sleep was not simply a physical act. It was spiritual, risky, uncertain. Food, too, played its role in the struggle for rest. Ship's biscuits were hard and often infested with weevils. Salted meat turned rancid in the heat. Stomachs churned with indigestion, making slumber uneasy. On long voyages, fresh water grew foul, and wine or beer often replaced it. Drinking heavily numbed some into sleep, but at a cost. Headaches, sluggishness, irritability. In this way, rest and sustenance were locked in a vicious cycle. Poor food led to poor sleep. Poor sleep weakened the body, and weakness made food harder to stomach. And yet, even in such hardship, sailors found moments of strange comfort. Hammocks, despite their dampness, offered a kind of safety from rolling decks. The creak of timbers and the constant sway became familiar, almost soothing. For some, the sea's rhythm lulled rather than disturbed. Diaries reveal sailors who spoke of the rocking as a mother's cradle, carrying them back to childhood. One man wrote that the hammock was the only friend that does not betray me. It holds me when I am too weary to hold myself. But these were exceptions. More often, sailors woke abruptly, to shouts of "all hands" or the crack of thunder. Rest could vanish in an instant, stolen by duty or danger. A storm did not wait for a man to finish his dream. A battle did not pause for tired eyes. The sea demanded wakefulness, even at the cost of health. As voyages stretched onward, this deprivation accumulated. Men aged quickly. Wrinkles etched faces, hair thinned, teeth rotted. Some sailors began voyages in their 20s and returned years later looking twice their age. The wear of sleeplessness and hardship showed plainly. And not all returned at all. For many, the hammock that carried them through weary nights became the hammock that carried their body to the sea, weighted with shot and lowered into the waves in a final, silent rest. Still, they endured. Why? For pay, perhaps, though it was often meager. For adventure, sometimes, though most knew only toil. For survival, for lack of other choices. Many were pressed into service, forced aboard against their will. Others were criminals offered a choice between the gallows and the sea. In such cases, the restless nights were endured because there was no alternative. And yet, perhaps endurance itself became its own reward. To survive months of broken sleep, to rise at every bell, to keep watch in storm and calm alike, This bred a strange pride. Sailors spoke of their toughness, their ability to outlast the hardships that would break weaker men. Their songs carried this pride, echoing across decks, rough voices singing of far-off lands, of sweethearts left behind, of the endless horizon. Music stitched together their broken hours, a fragile comfort against fatigue. In their songs, in their rituals, in their brief stolen naps, sailors created a culture of endurance. It was not restful, but it was human. Even in misery they found ways to belong, to continue, to laugh. A jest shared in the dark, a tune hummed before sleep, a hammock that swayed like a cradle. These small things carried them forward. And so the question deepens. If life at sea was so relentlessly exhausting, how did men continue to volunteer voyage after voyage? What drew them back to the rolling decks, to the sleepless hammocks, to the ceaseless bells of watch duty? Was it necessity, greed, adventure, or perhaps something deeper, a calling toward the sea itself, restless as their sleep, endless as the horizon? That is the question we carry onward as the voyage of this story continues.